as Chris said, I'm a co-founder of 280 North. My two co-founders are also here. Ross and Tom is somewhere. We are primarily responsible for a framework called Cappuccino. We just released our latest version, 0.8.1. I will talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. But as Chris said, I kind of wanted to do something a little bit differently and kind of talk about what was this kind of passion / side project for us for the past couple of months, and has now increasingly become more important as we start preparing for kind of Cappuccino 1.0, and that is documentation. So I think it goes without saying that documentation is really important, and I think most documentation of most open source projects kind of sucks, ours included. And I kind of want to start this with kind of the funny story behind Cappuccino documentation. So if you go today to Cappuccino documentation, this is kind of what it looks like. It's your generic open source documentation, which is, you know, we figured out how to use the tool that spits out the method names, and that's more or less it. There are some places we were able to have some good descriptions. Generally, it's not that great. We lucked out, however, because since Cappuccino was based on an existing framework, and you know, we were basically implementing a spec that already exists. Kind of the open secret in the Cappuccino community is that you should never go to our docs and instead just go to developer.apple.com. And if you want to find out about CPView, you just read about NSView, and the documentation applies 100%. Not only that, but if those aren't good enough, you can just hit the GNU step documentation, which is also pretty darn good, and again applies 100%. And if that's not good enough, then you can hit like all the different Cocoa blogs and books and stuff, and you know, we even today recommend a couple Cocoa books to our users. So we kind of lucked out in this regard, but we're trying to change that for 1.0. The way I look at it is that we got 80% for free. Like most open source projects, you know, day one have zero documentation. We had like 70 to 80% good documentation. The problem is achieving that last 20% is impossible with this model of, oh, just go ask Apple how to do it. Obviously, we can't change their docs. We can't add anything new. So what we'd really like to do for Cappuccino 1.0 is have truly world-class documentation. And that's kind of a problem because documentation's hard. And I think it's particularly hard for any new project, especially open source. And the reason I'm talking about this here today, and the reason Chris asked me to talk about this, is that I think our community is at a place where we could really benefit a lot from kind of a revolution in documentation. You know, we're at a place right now where we're trying to really sell JavaScript to a lot of people, being able to do a lot more than it could before. You know, we're even taking the step of saying, you know, you should be able to write your servers in JavaScript. And to be able to do that, to be able to convince people of kind of an already sketchy idea, they need to be able to know how to use this stuff. And again, the problem with most open source projects is that they're really cool, they're really advanced, but the documentation is kind of terrible on day one. And with these kind of programming problems that have nothing to do with code, I think there's a tendency to kind of look at it in two different ways. One of them is to think it's a cultural problem. And this is kind of what the testing community has done, right? They've said, well, testing was a cultural problem. We have the right tools for testing. What we need to do is to build a culture of testing. And it's worked out pretty well. An example, I guess the flip side to that is to say it's a technological problem. And I usually tend to side with that. I happen to think that most problems have technical reasons and technical solutions. And a good example of that is version control, right? I think most people are using version control incorrectly, not because we had the wrong culture, but we had the wrong tools. You know, when Git came out, I think all of us started using version control completely differently. We all became much better and much more like tightly knit community thanks to that, and it was all thanks to just a tool that actually did its job correctly. And what I'm proposing today is that I think that we do documentation completely wrong. And not subjectively like, oh, I don't like it wrong, but like mathematically provably wrong. And I think the main cause of this is documentation and comments. That's my thesis for you. I was trying to make it clever and save it to the end, but you know, when you make your slides the day before, you can't afford to do that. So I think that this is the root cause of bad documentation in the JavaScript community, in the open source community, in most communities in general. And so before I get into exactly why that is, I want to give you guys a glimpse of how your users who are using your products interact with your documentation and what the problems are. So this is obvious, right? Day one, you have no documentation. I think that's okay. I think you'll never solve that problem. Day one, you should have no documentation. The problem is that day 2, 3, 4, 5 months later, you still have really poor documentation. And you get into this place, eventually, if you're, I think, a good open source project, where you have either incomplete or incorrect documentation. And this happens for a lot of reasons, right? Open source projects iterate very quickly, so it's hard to keep the documentation up to date. And also, when the source changes, your documentation becomes incorrect, right? You fix a bug and the documentation no longer matches, et cetera, et cetera. So for a whole number of reasons, it's really hard to keep your documentation up to date with whatever tool you're selling to users. And what this means is that your users are, the second your documentation isn't good enough, they're going to start looking at blogs, they're going to start looking at other places, and eventually they'll end up here. Your IRC room, otherwise known as purgatory. This is the worst place on earth on the internet. Like, I hate this so much. You go into the IRC room and you're like, oh, I'm using this new tool. I'm naive and I want to know how it works. And your general response is, why are you trying to do that, idiot? Like, oh, come on. Like, just take my word for it. There's a reason I'm trying to call these functions. Just tell me how they work. And then you have to go through the slow, grueling process of they have the information, you don't. So you have to be nice to them while they get to be a dick to you. And it's terrible. It's absolutely terrible. Like, this is a cultural problem. This is not going to, no IRC tool in the world will make people not be jerks on IRC. But, so kind of a corollary or, you know, a side goal of Socratic is to make sure your normal users never end up on your IRC room. We try really hard to keep our IRC room very civil. In fact, if 280 North goes out of business, if everyone stops using cappuccino, I will still say, you know, this company was a success because we were pretty good in our IRC room. So again, we try to keep people out of here. You know, for your own benefit, we're trying to keep people out of your IRC room. So the other problem with documentation for your users is that it's generally not rich, right? It's generally just a bunch of text, when a lot of times a movie or a picture would be a lot better for them. And both these problems lead to this that I kind of alluded to, which is at the end of the day, your documentation ends up all over the place, right? It's really exciting when you have a new project when people start blogging about it, but blog posts are the worst forms of documentation because they never get updated. Like, there are a ton of projects where, like, the way you theme is described in a blog post that came out, you know, a year ago, and that's the #1 hit on Google, and it's not the way you theme anymore. And so you go and you try it, and it's wrong, and then you go into the IRC room because it doesn't work, and then you're back to square one. So I think that ideally, most people would have to hit your main docs. Obviously, you want to have a community that, like, talks about your project and everything, but ideally, you want your website for your project to be the central place where people get information. Because the other problem is that users, like, it seems really intuitive to us, like, oh yeah, there was a blog post 3 years ago that described how to do this. Why didn't you check that? Well, it's really hard for users to know this, right? They go to your main site, and if they don't find it, they're kind of stuck. This is another huge problem, right? Like, all this applies 7-fold for, like, or 100-fold for Japanese or whatever. Like, we have poor documentation in English, no documentation in any other language, right? And obviously that's really bad because most people don't speak English. So if you want your project to be successful, it should be really easy to localize your documentation. And this is the absolute worst problem. This is the problem we're trying to fix, which is all this other stuff is kind of okay and expected. Like, you have bad documentation, whatever. That's okay as long as it's capable of getting better. But because of the way most of our documentation systems are set up, we make it so difficult for people to contribute back documentation. So what we learned is that people who want to document cappuccino are generally not our core contributors. You know, our core contributors want to write code. It's generally people who are writing actual apps that want to write our documentation. And they're actually the best suited for this, right? They just spent all this time going through the hell that you created to learn how to use your framework. Now they want to give that back. Well, now you've got new hoops for them to jump through, right? Well, your main users are probably not using version control, right? They're using your nightly builds or whatever. So step one is they might have to learn Git or SVN or whatever to get your code just to be able to document it, right? So that may be a challenge for them. Step two, they need to learn how to build your product or whatever, right? Because you can't commit code that you haven't built. Step three is you have to learn how to use kind of an obtuse documentation tool. We use Doxygen. It's not the easiest thing to install and learn. And finally, they have to learn your whole, your culture of patches or whatever. They have to make a patch. They have to send it to you. You might say, come back with them with like you're using tabs instead of spaces or whatever. And at the end of the day, it's just really, really hard for them to make any sort of real contribution. And if it's really hard to make a real contribution, then you can imagine no one's ever going to take the time to do all this to like fix capitalization or whatever in your code, right? And in your documentation. So now I want to talk about the problems for us, like the maintainers of projects. Now, there's some dispute over this. This is my opinion. I think documentation in text is incredibly annoying. I don't like having to scroll pages in between methods. I don't like seeing a bunch of stuff that's designed for other people to learn. I especially don't like seeing HTML in my comments. Like, I'm already programming one language. I don't want to see whatever crazy language you invented to like do documentation in my comments all green, right? Again, there's this problem. How do you localize like documentation in comments? Are you going to have like 50 languages all in the comment? No, of course not. And documentation in text in comments is annoying to me. Imagine as someone who doesn't speak your language, where there's all this foreign language that's all like in some funky color that they don't understand what it means. I've used Japanese source code. This sucks. I hate it. Not Japanese source code, just the fact that it's in that language. Oh, sorry, this got cut off, but it says. It requires specialized tools, that may not exist for your language, and then the other thing was, or framework. So the problem with this is that, this is kind of a spectrum, right? Like on one extreme you have us. We kind of almost invented a new language, right? We added to JavaScript. So day one we had a problem where no documentation tool existed to handle our language, and that's pretty terrible. And I think we're going to see more and more of that, right? We're starting to see in the JavaScript world more people creating kind of DSLs or brand new languages on top of JavaScript, like CoffeeScript and Objective-J, which is ours. And right off the bat, you don't have a tool that can properly localize, properly document that. So what we actually had to do was use an existing tool called Doxygen. And I said, oh, this should be easy. It's plugin based. I can create a new parser for my language. Well, you have to write the plugins in C++. And I didn't get into the web to write C++ again. So that was out. So what we actually ended up doing is someone in our community took the time to write a converter from Objective-J to Objective-C just so we could feed it into Doxygen, just so we can get the shitty documentation that we have now. So that's pretty bad. And it's also a problem like in other languages. Obviously, any new language is going to have this problem. And also, in a very dynamic languages, you're going to have this too, such as Ruby and JavaScript, where you're kind of almost creating DSLs, right? Like your documentation tool probably doesn't know that class.create means you're creating a class. It can't pick up on that automatically, right? And yes, I know I misspelled language there. Here's the other bad part, which is it's really hard to include rich media, right? And this gets back to the whole languages within your comments. It's bad enough I have to read this documentation that's not meant for me in the comments, without all of a sudden there's like a video tag in there or a random link or stuff like that. And on top of that, there's the question of where you put this stuff, right? Well, if the images and the videos end up in your source repo, then all of a sudden, it takes a long time to download my source code just because there are a bunch of stupid movies in there, right? Which you should have, but not in your source repo. And ultimately, just like it's hard for the people using your stuff to contribute comments, documentation, it sucks for you to have to actually review it. I can tell you that when I get a commit or like a pull request, which is entirely documentation, the temptation to ignore forever or allow immediately without review is super high, and that should not be the case. So we're working on this new tool called Socratic. We're not done. We're specifically announcing it to ask for help from you guys. And it's kind of a new take on documentation. Our idea is if we want to have really great documentation for 1.0, we want to build a system that allows us to quickly build up documentation. And we've tried to address all the different problems. And the first one was the parser problem, right? Every time you start a new documentation tool, kind of step one is a not so fun programming task of building a parser. And what some people have done is create like little pseudo languages or whatever to create easier parsers that are meant mainly for documentation, but again, you have to learn how to use this, et cetera, et cetera. So we are really, really good at piggybacking off of other people's success. I think that's one of our best qualities. And so what we've done is, First, let me say this is the guy who's actually making this. This is our intern. This is what he looks like in case you're a visual learner. That's his Twitter. He's actually doing all the work. I just sat down and pontificated over the phone to him, and he said, okay, I'll implement it. But anyways, what we're doing is using existing technologies. And TextMate already has a huge storage of language definitions. So basically what Socratic is capable of doing is, if you already have a TextMate bundle for your language, Socratic knows how to parse and create documentation for it. And if you're a brand new language and you don't have a TextMate bundle, well, at least it's two birds with one stone, right? Because not only are you creating the documentation parser, but you're also getting the plugin for the most used text editor for free. And so if you're not familiar with the way TextMate handles source code, it's really quite cool. I personally think that TextMate is one of the ugliest programs ever created. That's why I don't use it. However, internally it is quite beautiful. And this is what it does. It actually creates these things called scopes. So basically, right here, that's some Objective-J code. That's the class name. And as you can see, it knows it's in the Objective-J source, and it knows it's within a class implementation. So as it's parsing it, it kind of creates like a tree of your source code, like live, right? And so here I have a method within table view, and as you can see, once again, it knows we're in the source code that's Objective-J, which is, kind of like JavaScript. It knows that we're in a, implementation of a class and blah, blah, blah. And it even knows that my cursor was right here when I was doing this. It even knows that I'm in the argument type and what kind of type it is. So TextMate is incredibly smart. It knows exactly what's going on in all your source code. And there's already a library in Ruby called TextPow, which uses this information to syntax highlight. And you should check it out. It's very cool. And we took this idea a little bit further. And what we actually do when you run Socratic on your source code is we build up the DOM of your source. So this is kind of how you can imagine it being, that's that little snippet. If you're familiar with HTML, then this should be very familiar to you. We're basically taking all those scopes and building the tag soup out of them. And the really cool thing about that is that allows us to create queries, right? So all of a sudden, you don't have to write parsers for your language or your DSL or your framework anymore. You can just do queries, and this is a very, very powerful thing. So this is just like an example. If you imagine docs.cappuccino.org/classes/CP table column, you would do something just like jQuery where you say, well, give me all the implementations where the name of the class is CP table column. And you can do many more powerful things too, like in Cappuccino, there is a convention that all methods that start with an underscore are private. So you could actually say, give me all the methods in the class CP table column which do not start with an underscore. And that's really easy to do with this querying language. So when you build your templates, it's really, really easy to do things like, well, give me all the strings within the function class.create, and I'm going to say those are my classes. So it's really a powerful templating language. The second thing is, I think, pretty obvious from what I was talking about earlier. If you're not putting your documentation in the source code, then it's a wiki. And it's a media wiki, so people can put movies and whatever they want. The other interesting part is that it's a wiki based on Git. And this is actually one of the places where I'm very curious if people have other ideas. The idea here is that we're trying to make it really easy to keep your documentation up to date with your source code. So what commonly happens is you have a lot of people running off trunk, but your source code represents the stable branch, and no one wants to update the stable branch, like source code that's public, because, well, then it would represent stuff that's not shipping. So what we actually do is, since it's a Git-based wiki, it matches the branches of your source code. So if you tag a release as 0.6 or whatever, when people hit your source code, they can actually say, well, show me the documentation as it was during 0.6, or show me what the documentation for this new feature branch is, or show me blah, blah, blah. So it matches all the branches and creates a pretty powerful way of managing the different documentation for the different versions of your source code. Secondly, we built in support for GitHub issues. So at some point, we're going to make it generic and let you do whatever. Right now, we're just trying to ship something. So this tries to solve that original problem of they go to your documentation, it's wrong, they have to go somewhere else, etc. What we're trying to do is you hit the documentation, and you see the description of the method, and right under it, you see all the bugs filed on that method, right? So if the method says should return 6, and there's a bug filed on it that says returns 5, immediately there's a problem. You don't need to go try it. think that maybe it's your fault, end up in the IRC room or whatever. And the next step to this is we would also really like to include the tests right next to it. So I think it would be cool if you have the method description, here are all the bugs, and here are all the tests. So if you see that a test is failing, it's almost like an automatic bug, right? So we haven't worked on that part at all yet, but the GitHub issues thing is working pretty well. So yeah, so kind of to sum up what Socratic is doing, it's using text-made bundles to automatically generate a wiki for your documentation, that sits on top of Git, so it can automatically track the different branches and stuff of your repo. It will automatically synchronize with your bugs and tests. And the other thing we've done is just build in out-of-the-box support for GitHub. And the idea is you just type Socratic and then your GitHub URL, and you have a server that's running that's your documentation. So it should be really, really easy the day you ship your code to have really great documentation for it. And of course, it's built entirely on top of CommonJS. And this is important for two reasons. One, because I think we really need this right now because, again, we're kind of a new community. We're building lots of new stuff. We should really document it well. And the other thing is, I think this could be a really powerful coup for us because documentation, again, I believe to be like a space that's not really paid attention to a lot. And I think if we create like the gold standard of a documentation tool, we can get a lot of people to be running CommonJS servers, serving this stuff up, and that will introduce them to kind of JavaScript on the server, et cetera. So I'm pretty excited about that. So what I'm going to show you now is not the actual documentation tool. It's not done. I'm going to show you kind of the tool that we use to analyze what's going on in the background. You'll understand in a second. So this is, here, I'll show you what happens right now. So again, when you load this up the first time, so again, the idea is that you would not do this in a UI. You run it off your server. But again, it's set up right now to automatically piggyback off of any existing GitHub repo. So I've already have the one set up for Cappuccino. And the way the queries are working right now is that they are file-based. But again, you could turn this around. So right now, again, all it does is this is being automatically generated from our queries. So there's no fancy parsing taking place. We're just saying, give me everything that looks like a method within everything that looks like a class, et cetera. So here we go, if you look at individual methods. And again, we have the capability of, here are all the bugs, and you can link the bug to the issue, and now those in the system are considered tied together or whatever. So again, this is kind of the tool we've been using to test out these technologies. This is not the way we think the documentation will look, obviously. So yeah, we're really excited about this project. Again, we'd like it to be ready for 1.0 before then, so we can actually have really good documentation. We're really interested in your guys' ideas. Ultimately, we want this to be a really great documentation tool for everyone. If you have any ideas, kind of like things that have always bugged you about documentation, feel free to talk to us. If you want to start writing code for this, feel free to talk to us. There really isn't one repo for this yet because, again, our intern's partially working on it and we are. But in the coming weeks, we'll release kind of one place where all this stuff is together. And yeah, so that is Socratic. Get back to our presentation. All right, so that was, again, Socratic. And now I want to talk about Cappuccino just for a little bit about our new release. The coolest part about the new release is that it is built entirely on top of CommonJS, which means if you're already running Narwhal or any other CommonJS distribution, you can now install Cappuccino with the JavaScript package manager known as Tusk. Tusk install Cappuccino, and you will have it. The other cool thing is that our entire system is now on top of CommonJS, which means we don't build with Ruby anymore. We don't require our users to install some crazy gem or anything. We use build tools that are built with JavaScript. We use JavaScript across the board. All the tools we provide, the custom ones, are built on top of CommonJS. So I'm really excited about this. This was actually one of our main complaints. I really don't understand why. Like, Ruby comes installed on macOS 10. I've never understood why people find this to be hard, but whatever. If the users want it, there. You don't need to know Ruby anymore. The one, I think, valid complaint was that if people wanted to fix bugs in our build tools or whatever, if they didn't know Ruby, then yeah, of course, it was going to be hard for them. So now that's not an issue anymore. It's one language across the entire system. We, I think, are now at a point where we can have parity with other languages like Python and Ruby, where that's the case. So that's pretty exciting. The other really cool addition is CP Table View. This is one of the classes that was most obviously missing when we shipped Cappuccino. It's one of the most used classes in Cocoa. It's really, really important on the web and on the desktop. And this was created entirely by outside contributors, which is pretty exciting to us, mainly because that means I don't have to know at all how it works, and that's always good. And it's very performant, it's very beautiful, and I not only think that we have like one of the coolest looking and performing table views, but it's also one of the easiest to make because we shipped 08 with nib to sib support for table view, and I'd like to show you that now. So if you're not familiar with Cappuccino, we have kind of two main ways that people make kind of UIs for our framework. One is with our tool called Atlas, and the other one is using Apple's existing interface builder tool, which we're capable of converting into web interfaces. And ever since we released nib to sib, this is kind of the main way that people make UIs with Cappuccino now, because I think it's way easier. So I'll go ahead and show you that, how you make a table view in Cappuccino. So here's this zip file, which if you've ever done anything on Mac OS X, this is kind of how you make interfaces in OS X. So this is kind of like the main window of my application. And if I want a table view, I just bring it up here. And you know, you can add columns and give it alternating row colors and that sort of thing. So that's kind of all it takes to actually make a table view. And then to get the data, you just need to give it a data source. So we use this technology called connections. So I just connect the table view to my app controller, which will be providing the data for the table view. And then I save it. And I can there you go. That'll convert the file. So this is the table view we just created, and it's got 5 million rows, and as you can see, it looks pretty darn good. Of course, we're just providing dummy data, but it's still pretty impressive for, went away, there we go. So that's how you make table views in Cappuccino. We're really happy with this feature. I'd like to show you some more features from table view, but I'm going to take the chance to kind of show you two features together. So something we released recently with 08 is this new cap record tool. And basically what this lets you do is record interactions. And basically the idea is, you know, your users can kind of record what they're doing, and if they have a bug, they can send it to you, and then you can see what's going on. So I'll go ahead and hit record here, and I'll reload the app. So these are kind of the different kind of table view styles. This is like a list style. You know, you can sort these rows. Am I crashing here? I guess you can sort the rows. I'm sorry. There you go. Okay. So you know, you can drag and drop, and we've got like different kind of drag and drop and stuff. And then if I hit stop, table test 1. This will actually save it on the server, and then, you know, wherever the server is running. Everything's just slow. Close some apps. There we go. So there we go. It'll actually replay again everything we just did. This is again really cool because people can send you, where they're experiencing bugs and stuff, and then you can profile on your machine or do whatever debugging you want. And what we actually found, which we didn't expect, was that this tool was actually really useful for this device over here, the iPad. Because as is generally the case with the web, we take one step forward and like 1,000 back. So the iPad is really great web-wise because it only runs WebKit, so we can rely on all these fancy features which we're usually afraid to use or whatever. But it's really bad because it's kind of jettisoned us back to 2000 where we didn't have any sort of tools at all. There is basically no way to debug any sort of web stuff on this device. There's a little Debug Console built into Safari. It sucks. I can say that because I wrote it, and it's terrible. Like, it basically tells you the errors you're having, but it cuts off the strings. So so get this. You're running it, you see an error, it doesn't fit. So your best option is to turn it sideways, and then you can see a little bit more of the error because you have a little bit more room. So that's basically the extent of debugging on the iPad. So what we've done, and I'm just going to load this up here. Okay, so I guess the other question is, well, why can't I just debug in Safari? They're both WebKit, right? Well, that is true for the most part, but if you have bugs that happen due to like touch events and stuff, you can't because Safari doesn't have touch events on this machine. And you can take the time to like manually recreate the events yourself, but that's a real pain. So this tool is really great because you can actually, here, let me, so take a second to load here. You can actually do whatever interactions you want on the iPad, let it crash, and then you can run it back here and then profile it or catch the errors or break on the error and see exactly what's going on because we can translate all the events and everything. So let me just do some stuff here. Again, I'm sorry that I'm not showing you this live. We wanted to hook it up, but as it turns out, this thing does not export video by default. Like, your app has to support that feature, and we thought it was silly to write a native app to wrap the WebKit to show how cool web apps are on the iPad. So. Hopefully I can now show you this here. Some of these tabs. This will take a second to load. I'm sorry, our server's pretty slow. This is the one I just made. Here we go. So as you can see, that's me doing all the touch events and stuff and getting all the wonderful CSS redraw errors, as you can see. So this allows you to go in there, debug, see what's going on. And yeah, so I think that's pretty cool. We've been using this tool to write kind of an iPad app that we are going to open source soon. It's called Scrapbook. I'll show you that very briefly. We're going to open source this completely, and we're also going to release it. It basically lets you create scrapbooks. So come here. You can choose a template. This is pretty cool. It actually grabs the images straight from your Facebook account. This is using a new plugin for Cappuccino called Facebook Kit that we released recently. So, and as you can see, you've got like different templates and stuff, and you can grab the images and drag them in and do touchy kind of things. So there we go. So yeah, so that's pretty cool. Again, we're going to be open sourcing this. The other cool thing is we're going to be releasing this, and we're going to have a print button. So we'll actually send you your scrapbook printed out in paper, so you can show it to your grandma who does not have an iPad. Or apparently those are built for her, so maybe it'll be for you. So one of the cool things about the way we built this app is that we used Atlas to do it. So Atlas is this other tool I was talking about. Like, we have nib2sib, which is completely open source, so you don't have to pay us or anything to use it. And Atlas is kind of our version of this Apple tool. And the really cool thing about it is we recently added this plugins feature where you can write your own custom UI plugins for Atlas. So if I open this up, this is the project. And what we did was write a plugin for kind of our scrapbook pages. So we're actually able to give our designer just Atlas and this plugin, and he doesn't need to send us Photoshop files that we need to cut up or anything. He can actually just build these templates himself. So I'll show you that. So all the little template pages you saw running on the iPad there are actually created right here. So this is how he lays them out. And again, he doesn't need to know any code or anything. And these things have their own little custom inspectors. So he comes here and he can say, well, this is actually a cover, or back cover, or page, or whatever. And this is really cool because you can write your own custom ones of these. So if you're using Atlas and you have a new UI element, you can write your own inspectors and allow people to use it. Yeah. And you can actually do this in Interface Builder too. So if you want to write your own IB plugins, again, in the open source world without having to deal with us, you can do that. And finally, the last thing I wanted to show that we're actually announcing today, this is not part of 0.8, is an improvement to nib to sib. And we thought it was we've actually had this kind of under wraps for a while, but we thought it was a good time to talk about this feature given all the stuff that's going on with what languages you're allowed to use on iPad and not. And I always thought it was not a very interesting question of how to get more stuff into the iPad. I think if Apple wants to have the lock and key to this device, that's fine. To me, a much more interesting question is, how do you get stuff that's already on the iPad out? So as I've already said, we have this technology called nib to sib, which is capable of transforming Mac OS X desktop apps into HTML5 web apps. Well, we've actually extended nib to sib to allow the same kind of thing to happen with iPhone apps. So I'll show you that very quickly. Right here, just like before, I'm going to open up Apple's tools. And this is, if you've never built an iPhone app, this is kind of how you do it. These are their visual tools. You can come in here and set everything up. So I'm obviously building something very simple here. And if I hit run, this launches the iPhone simulator. Well, at least this isn't my bug. This is Apple stuff. Okay, here we go. All right, there we go. So this is obviously a very simple app, right? So what we do is, if we save this now, I can go here, and just like before, I can run nib to sib. Oh, sorry. There we go. I have to include the framework. There we go. So now, what the app that started off as an iPhone / iPad app or whatever will show up on the web, and it's completely converted. And this will run on Android or on Palm OS or whatever. And again, we've started off with just 3 or 4 classes, just like when we originally wrote nib to sib for the desktop. But we're adding more and more classes. And just like right now, nib to sib is a very, very complete tool if you're going from desktop to web. Hopefully, in a little while, this will be a very complete tool to go from iPhone to the web. So we're pretty excited about that. And I guess I'm running out of time. So I was going to show you a few apps running on 08, but since I'm out of time, I will just end it there and say, yeah, so this is important. So this is the URLs to get to all this stuff. Again, if you want to contact us about this documentation stuff or anything else you saw, feel free to do so. We're happy to hear all your comments. Thank you.